and gentlemen, welcome back to today's show. We got a good one for you today. All right, as always, never try to half-ass it on the show today. We are packed as usual. So, as we know, America already loves its generals too much, but National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and Chief of Staff John Kelly nonetheless deserve a special round of thanks for conclusively demonstrating why it's foolish to trust generals when they swap their uniforms for suits and ties. Kelly's hanging on to his job for now, but McMaster has gotten the boot from President Trump in favor of John Bolton, who is a genuinely terrifying individual, one of the fiercest warhawks of our times. I said he was the fiercest warhawk in American politics today, but Peter Moss of The Intercept says, our times. That's a lot. Yes. So, yeah. Whether it's Iran, North Korea, or Iraq, he says, bomb and all. The military option is pretty much the only one for which Bolton has any enthusiasm. The ascension to the White House by Bolton should be very scary. But that's not a reason to give a free pass and warm hug to McMaster and other generals who've gotten top White House jobs. A year ago, McMaster and Kelly, along with Defense Secretary General Mattis, were hailed by civilian Washington as the grown-ups in the Trump cabinet. While Mattis has not yet tarnished himself, Kelly and McMaster have displayed a range of failings, proving that generals are often the opposite of the trustworthy hands their civilian admirers believe them to be. That's because when generals emerge from military service, they are black boxes of political and emotional behavior. The military enforces strict rules on what its men and women, and particularly ones with a star on their shoulder, can say about political issue. Are you a, for example, Christian evangelical who distrusts Muslims and Jews? Do you believe Syrian and Honduran references are a mortal threat to our society? Should North Korea's nuclear installations be taken out with a preemptive strike? Does Hillary deserve to be locked up? Generals are not supposed to take positions on these issues, which means few people outside their immediate family know what to expect when they recover the right to speak freely. There's more. The much-admired effectiveness of generals is not automatically transferred to the civilian world. Soldiers who disobey a general's order can face a court-martial. There's a reason. That's the reason why the sure-handedness or its appearance can be easier to achieve in a top-down military setting than the horizontal mess of democracy. The civilian who displeases her White House boss may have to resign, but there's always the lucrative consolation of a big book contract or a cable news gig. Years in military brig are not a concern, thank goodness. We might like to believe that generals have a magic managerial touch, but these are projections rather than reality. It's very dangerous to have White House generals in the White House because it's a total different scenario. Again, the top-down military setting, that is something that is only available or is only prevalent in the military. Surprise, surprise, and few very direct places, I don't know, the fire department. That's not even but if you look at a well-organized part of society, like the military, and then you go to the executive branch, you cannot honestly expect these two things to work together. It's just very, very hard to expect these two things to work together, and the fact that that's what we're thinking about when we've got generals who are coming to run the same way that they did and try to impose order and discipline in a place where people have nothing but their interests on mind or about themselves. But it can be a very, 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 very hard thing to do. So yeah, we shouldn't be surprised when the shackled become unshackled and betray our illusions. The quickie version of Kelly's failures is this. He protected Rob Porter as his deputy, even though Porter's ex-wife accused him of violent abuse. He described undocumented immigrants as too lazy to get off their asses, and he lauded Confederate General Robert E. Lee is an honorable man, and he smeared a member of Congress who actively noted that Trump made insensitive comments to a grieving war widow. Remember, she said, "All hat, no barrel," or whatever. It was proof the loudest crazy people make the most noise, or something like that. It was Frederica Wilson. And go back and look it up. I don't even remember it, and it was a month ago, and it was a scandal where his chief of staff defended the president after he made inappropriate and insensitive, mean comments to a grieving war widow. McMaster was an unexpectedly reckless war hawk on North Korea until Trump shocked everyone and agreed to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. McMaster is also reported to have a general's impatience with civilians who don't toe his line. According to Foreign Policy, it refers to people who don't support him, who support him as patriots, while those who don't are reflecting an enemy narrative. The generals are not known for their modesty, and while it's true for a lot of people in Washington, it's useful at least to be capable of pretending that you are humble. It can be very, very helpful along the way. A lot of people in Washington, though, they don't like that. They're not high quality enough human beings for that. So, yeah, what's particularly ironic is that America's beloved war on terror generals hail from those lukewarm generation of military generals since, well, forever. We are approaching 20 years of combat in Afghanistan and Iraq with no end in sight, and still no general has the vision or courage to admit the folly. They ramble on about degrading the enemy, and after 12 months, they collect on their star on their way back home. As Tom Ricks, a well-guarded military reporter, has written, to a shocking degree, the Army's leadership ranks have been populated by mediocre officers. Ironically, our generals have grown worse as they've been lionized more and more by a society that is now reflexively deferential to the military. It's coming to a very interesting point, where we're like, you know what, the military, we take your word as gospel, and we are not even going to question that one little bit. All right. Yeah, and that's a very worrying place to be in, especially when our military is as smallly effective as it's at least at its least point in terms of personality, personnel, people running it, most political appointees, most political operatives, most politically motivated generals that we've seen really in a long time. All right, so yeah, the increasingly bitter Democratic primary in Georgia. We're turning tables now. For Georgia's closely watched gubernatorial election this year features two former state legislators, Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans, two Stacys, each of whom have touted their bona fides as the most progressive, most democratic, and most viable candidate in the race. While much of the national attention on the race is focused largely on stylistic differences, a little-noticed vote last year serves as another policy break on an issue that sharply divided the Democratic Party and primaries around the country, the role of banking sector and subprime lending crisis. In a vote last year over a bill called HB 192, which changed the liability standard for bank executives here, Abrams sided with Georgia Republicans and the banking lobby, while Evans led the oppositions. So that, to me, is a big checkmark for Evans, who led the opposition to this bill, when Abrams quietly sided with Georgia Republicans and the banking lobby as a Democrat. That is not good. Georgia has a particularly ugly history with predatory lending. The state was one of the hardest hit areas of the foreclosure crisis, with a record-breaking number of banks that failed, in part because they targeted some prime customers with deceptive promises and hidden fees. So some of the most abusive lending practices were pioneered in the metro Atlanta area, where banks target vulnerable long-time homeowners and lured them to refinance loans that ballooned in cost, prompting a crushing wave of foreclosures. Many of those targeted were elderly African Americans who were cash poor but owned prize homes in quickly gentrifying neighborhoods. So that's the problem. They targeted the weakest of those, the elderly African Americans, who they were kind of weak as they moved into their retirement, or cash poor, as this Intercept report calls it. But at least they had those prize homes. Let's get those prize homes. We don't care who we hurt. We don't care who we target. We just want to make more money for ourselves. In a blatant move to hold those responsible accountable, the Obama administration, using the FDIC and the Federal Trade Commission, filed a number of civil lawsuits against Georgia bank officials in an attempt to recover damages from executives that the regulators have claimed fueled reckless bank practices. In one such case that shocked the banking industry, FDIC versus Loudermilk, the Supreme Court of Georgia upheld claims that the FDIC and the former directors and officers of Buckhead Community Bank which had failed during the financial crisis, were liable for nearly $5 million in damages for making dangerous loans that violated the bank's own internal guidelines and lacked a proper documentation. Boom. The lawsuit was filed in 2012, but it was hung up for years as appellate courts grappled with questions that would impact whether the case would go to trial. The state Supreme Court issued its ruling in 2014, and the jury verdict did not come down until October 2016. Bank lobbyists and industry analysts were alarmed by the case. If bank executives and officers could face liability for reckless behavior, that might reshape the entire industry in Georgia. Yay, no more screwing elderly black people. My favorite thing. All right, so yeah, anyway. Within months of the verdict, the banking lobby moved swiftly back to HB 192, a bill introduced in January 2017 to effectively reverse the state Supreme Court decision. They wanted to go back to screwing elderly black people and others. Yay! No, that's actually freaking awful. The legislation changed the liability standard, making it more difficult to prosecute executives and high-level officers for decisions made at Georgia banks. The bill. So why should the people who are in charge of the companies be held responsible for the horrible decisions that they make? I don't know. Maybe that's just not how they want the system to work, or maybe they just have it sensibly works on every other company in the freaking world, and every other industry in the world. And the fact that Stacey, whatever the hell her name is, all right. So we need. Stacey Abrams sided with the Georgia Republicans and the bank lobby against the Atlanta people, and she's trying to call herself a progressive. That is just the saddest thing I have ever heard. The bill was sponsored by an all-Republican delegation, was listed as a priority bill by the GBA representatives, which is, by the way, the Georgia Bankers Association, representatives of several financial services in-industry lobby groups, including the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, pressured legislators to quickly pass the bill. State Rep. Beskin of Atlanta, the sponsor of HB 192, defended the legislation as a necessary step to bring stability. We need to be consistent with other states. It's hard to get people to serve on bank boards if they're open to legal liabilities. Well, that's too bad. Maybe they just gotta accept that's the way they're gonna be, and if they want to serve on a board, it's not like it's to be a fun time, free for all. Screw the people of Georgia whenever the hell you want. It's just absolutely incredible. Like, that's like the stuff they think they can so easily get away with here. Like, it's incredible. Like, they're like, but I don't want to serve on a bank board if I can't screw people. Yeah, so it's just incredible. At that time, Stacey Abrams served as the leader of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus. When it came to divisive issues before the legislature, the Democratic Caucus leader typically makes a speech in opposition to a bill to explain the caucus position. Instead, on the day of the vote, it was Evans who rose to represent the Democratic Caucus and gave the minority report opposing HB 192. Why? Because Abrams was supporting it. After Evans rose to speak against the bill, she returned to her seat in the chamber. Abrams then walked over to Evans to confer with her, as shown by the legislative video from the day, though the audio of the exchange is not available. Following the conversation, the roll call opened, and Abrams cast a vote in line with nearly every member of the Republican caucus in support of HB 192. Evans voted against it, along with the 30 other